Out on the vast, unforgiving plains of the Dakota Territory, a single lantern in a window was a fragile prayer against an ocean of darkness. For Alina Harvey, a widow, living miles from any neighbor, that light was her only companion. But on a night when the heavens themselves seemed to be at war, her solitude was shattered by a desperate plea for help. She made a choice that night, a choice born of conscience, to save 2 wounded Sioux boys from the vengeance of a determined posse. But an act of mercy in the Old West rarely goes unpunished. The next morning, she awoke to find 50 silent warriors encircling her home. They hadn't come for a parley. They had come for justice, and her life hung precariously in the balance. This is the story of what happened next. The storm that rolled over the Black Hills in the late autumn of 1876 wasn't just weather. It was a living entity, a ravenous beast of wind and rain that devoured the landscape. It clawed at the sod roof of Alina Harvey's small homestead, shrieked through the cracks in the cottonwood door, and turned the vast prairie into a churning, muddy sea. Inside, the world had shrunk to the golden circle of light cast by her kerosene lamp. Alina sat at her small hand-hewn table, the worn pages of a letter from her sister, back in Ohio, a flimsy shield against the tempest's fury. She had been alone for 2 years, ever since the fever had taken her husband, Thomas. He had bought this quarter section with dreams of raising cattle and a family, but all he had raised was the cabin before the earth reclaimed him. Alina, too stubborn, and perhaps too heartbroken to retreat, east had stayed. She learned the brutal calculus of survival, the heft of an axe, the recoil of a Winchester, the silent language of a land that could kill you as easily as it could feed you. It was a sound nearly lost in the gale that first pricked her attention, not the howl of a coyote or the groan of the cabin's timbers. It was a human sound, a thin, reedy cry of pain that was snatched away by the wind as soon as it was uttered. Alina froze her hand, hovering over the letter. Her heart began a frantic, heavy beat against her ribs. No one should be out in this. No traveler, no hunter, no soul in their right mind. Her first instinct was fear, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. The talk in the nearest settlement, Red Creek, had been filled with vitriol for weeks. A freight wagon had been raided, 2 men killed. The blame, as always, fell squarely on the Lakota Sioux. Sheriff Brody, a man whose jaw seemed permanently clenched in righteous anger, had been riding with a posse for days, scouring the territory, vowing to cleanse the hills of every last renegade. The sound came again, closer this time, a desperate gasp from just beyond her door. Alina rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She took the Winchester .73 from its pegs above the fireplace, its cool, familiar weight a small comfort. She moved to the door, listening. A soft scratching, a weak thump, and then silence, save for the storm's relentless assault. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy iron bar from its brackets. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it inward with a deafening crash. Rain and cold air flooded the small cabin, guttering the lamp flame, and there, collapsed on her doorstep, lay the reason for the sounds. 2 boys. Neither could have been more than 14 or 15 summers old. They were Sioux, their affiliation clear from their buckskin leggings, and the single feather tied into the matted wet hair of the one who was still conscious. He was trying to shield the other, who lay limp and unnervingly still. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering violently, their faces etched with a pain and exhaustion that went far beyond their years. The conscious boy's dark eyes locked onto hers wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. He held a small, crudely made knife, but his arm trembled so badly He could barely keep it aloft. Alina saw the wound, then a dark, ragged tear in his shoulder, the buckskin around it, stained almost black with blood. His companion had fared worse. A bloody poultice of mud and leaves was failing to staunch a gruesome wound on his thigh, a clear bullet hole. Alina's mind raced. The Posse! These must be the renegades Sheriff Brody was hunting. To help them was to invite the wrath of every white settler in a 100-mile radius. It was to mark herself as a traitor, an Indian lover. They would burn her out, or worse. The safe, sensible thing to do was to slam the door, bar it, and pretend she had seen nothing. But then she looked at the boy on the ground, his breathing shallow, his face ashen. He was just a child. Thomas's face flashed in her memory, pale, sweating his life, slipping away while she had watched helpless. She had made a promise to herself over his grave. She would never again stand by and watch someone die if she had the power to prevent it. "Get inside," she said, her voice firm though her heart hammered. She ignored the knife, stepping past the boy and gesturing into the warmth of the cabin. "Now, both of you." The boy with the knife, whose name she would later learn was Tashunka, hesitated. His gaze flickered from her face to the Winchester in her hands, then to his fallen friend. Alina set the rifle down by the door, a gesture of trust she prayed wasn't foolish. "I won't hurt you," she said, speaking slowly, hoping the tone, if not the words, would bridge the chasm between them. She knelt beside the unconscious boy, Chaitin. His skin was feverishly hot. He needs help. Now. Tashunka seemed to understand. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. The small knife clattered to the floorboards. With a surge of adrenaline, Alina helped him drag his brother inside, away from the storm's fury. She slammed the door shut and barred it, the sound echoing with a grim finality. She had just locked herself in with her decision. The world outside, with its posses and its prejudices, was shut out for now. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it would be back. The night was a fevered dream of desperate work. Alina boiled water, tearing precious sheets into clean bandages. She washed the boy's wounds with carbolic soap, her stomach churning at the severity of the injuries. Chaitin's leg was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but the flesh was already puffy and inflamed with infection. Tashunka's shoulder wound was a vicious gash, likely from a knife or an arrow in a frantic skirmish. He bore the pain with a stoicism that shamed her own anxieties, his eyes tracking her every move, watchful and wary. She moved with a grim efficiency born of frontier necessity. She remembered the poultices her grandmother, a woman who trusted herbs more than doctors used to make. She ground yarrow to staunch the bleeding and made a paste of willow bark for the fever that was already consuming Chaitin. She forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips and cleaned the wounds again. All the while, Tashunka watched. He said nothing, but a silent understanding began to form. When she needed more water, he gestured to the bucket. When she nearly dropped a hot pan, he steadied her arm. They were from different worlds, speaking different tongues, but in the small, lamplit cabin, they were united by the simple, urgent goal of keeping a young man alive. By the time the first grey fingers of dawn pierced the gloom, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Chaitin's fever had not broken, but his breathing was a little easier. Exhausted, Alina had finally sat down, her head slumping against the rough wall of the cabin. That's when she heard it. The rhythmic thud of approaching horses. Not one or two, but many. Panic seized her. The cellar, she whispered, her eyes wide. She grabbed Tashunka's arm, pulling him. "Quickly, you have to hide." He understood immediately. The fear was back in his eyes. but it was now alloyed with a fierce protectiveness. He looked at his brother, still barely conscious. There was no time. The riders were almost upon them. The root cellar was a small, musty space beneath the cabin floor, accessed by a trap door hidden under a bearskin rug. It was their only chance. With strength she didn't know she possessed, Alina helped Tashunka carry his brother down the short ladder into the damp, earthy dark. "Do not make a sound," she hissed her voice, a desperate plea. "No matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Tashunka gave a single sharp nod, his eyes like black stones in the dim light. Alina dropped the heavy trap door back into place, threw the rug over it, and kicked some dirt around the edges for good measure. She raced to the fireplace, stoking the flames to burn the bloody rags, and threw open the door to air out the scent of soap and herbs. She grabbed her Winchester, just as a hard fist hammered on the door. "Mrs. Harvey, open up. This is Sheriff Brody." Alina's heart was a wild bird trapped in her chest. She took a steadying breath, composed her face into a mask of weary annoyance, and opened the door. Sheriff Samuel Brody stood there, flanked by a half-dozen hard-faced men. Brody was a tall man, made taller by a high-crowned hat. His face was weathered leather, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing. Behind him, more men on horseback formed a loose, intimidating circle around her small cabin. "The posse," Sheriff Alina said, her voice betraying only a slight tremor. "To what do I owe the honor of such an early call?" "The storm blew a couple of renegades off course," Brody said, his voice a low gravel. He scanned the inside of her cabin over her shoulder. "We tracked them this far before the rain washed it all out. A pair of Sioux boys." "You seen anything?" "I've seen nothing but the inside of my cabin for the last 12 hours, Sheriff." It was quite a storm. She leaned against the doorframe, trying to appear casual, praying the frantic beating of her heart wasn't visible through her dress. Brody's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that, Alina? No visitors? No one seeking shelter?" He took a step forward, forcing her to step back into the cabin. He entered without invitation, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. His men followed their presence, sucking the air from the small room. They smelled of wet leather sweat and a grim sense of purpose. "My husband Thomas always said you had a charitable heart," Brody continued, his gaze sweeping every corner of the room. "Sometimes too charitable for your own good." One of his deputies, a young man named Miller, with shifty eyes, kicked at the bearskin rug. Alina's blood ran cold. He was standing directly on top of the trapdoor. "What's under here?" Miller asked, nudging the rug with his boot. A rug, Deputy Alina snapped her fear, momentarily replaced by anger. "On top of the floorboards that my husband laid with his own 2 hands. I'd thank you not to scrape them up." Brody held up a hand, a flicker of something annoyance respect in his eyes. He walked around the cabin, peering into the small pantry, poking at the sack of flour. He ran a finger along the table. It came away clean. Alina had scrubbed away every trace of blood. "We heard a cry last night," Brody said, turning to face her. "One of my men posted on the ridge before the worst of the rain hit. Said it came from this direction. The wind plays tricks, Sheriff. It howls like a dying man sometimes." Brody was silent for a long moment. He stared at her, his pale eyes trying to peel back the layers of her composure. She met his gaze without flinching, a silent battle of wills fought in the tense quiet of the cabin. She could feel the presence of the boys beneath the floor, a secret radiating heat through the wood. She prayed the men couldn't feel it too. She prayed Chayton wouldn't moan in his feverish sleep. Finally, Brody seemed to make a decision. "All right, boys, let's move out. They're probably halfway to the reservation by now." The men began to file out, their relief palpable, but Brody paused at the door. He turned back to Alina, his expression grim. "Just so we're clear," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Aiding a hostile is the same as being one. The men who were killed on that freight wagon had families. The people in Red Creek are scared, and they're angry. If I find out you've lied to me, Alina, not even your husband's good name will be able to help you." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp as a blade. He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any real courtesy, and was gone. Alina stood motionless, listening to the sound of the horses fade into the distance. Only when she was sure they were truly gone did she allow herself to collapse into a chair, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had won the first battle. But Sheriff Brody's shadow lingered long and dark, and she knew with a sickening certainty that he was not a man who gave up easily. He would be back. The silence that descended after the posse left was heavier and more threatening than their presence had been. Alina waited, counting to 500, before she dared to move. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind sounded like the returning hoofbeats of Brody's horse. Finally, she slid the heavy bar back across the door and lifted the trapdoor. The stench of fear and stale air wafted up from the cellar. Tashunka was crouched in the darkness, a rock in his hand, ready to fight. He looked past her, searching for the threat. "They're gone," Alina said softly. "It's safe." Getting Chaitan out of the cellar was an ordeal. He was limp, his fever raging, and a low moan escaped his lips as they jostled his injured leg. Once he was back in the cot, Alina saw with a sinking heart that the infection had worsened. Angry red streaks were beginning to snake up his thigh. The willow bark wasn't enough. Without proper medicine, he would lose the leg and likely his life. Desperation gnawed at her. She had nothing stronger. The town doctor in Red Creek, Doc Miller, was a kindly old man, but he was Deputy Miller's uncle. Going to him was impossible. As she racked her brain, pacing the small cabin, Tashunka touched her arm. He pointed to his brother, then pointed insistently out the window towards the east, towards the distant rolling hills. He made a gesture like a running horse, then pointed to himself. He wanted to go for help. "No," Alina said, shaking her head. "The posse is still out there. They'll find you." Tashunka's expression was desperate. He mimed his brother, shivering, then lying still. He was pleading with her, his eyes conveying a depth of anguish that needed no words. He knew as she did that Chaitan was dying. For the next few hours, a new routine settled in. Alina tended to Chaitan, cooling his head with damp cloths and forcing sips of water past his lips. Tashunka, seeing her exhaustion, took over the small chores of the homestead. He refilled the water bucket from the rain barrel split kindling with a surprising efficiency, and even tried to sweep the floor with her crude straw broom. They still had no common language, but a new one was forming between them, one of shared tasks and mutual respect. He watched her prepare the yarrow poultice, and the next time he ground the herbs for her without being asked. When she offered him a plate of salt pork and beans, he ate half, and then looked expectantly at her, not taking another bite until she had sat and eaten herself. In a quiet moment, he took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and drew on a spare piece of floorboard. He drew 2 figures on horseback hunting a buffalo. Then he drew more figures with hats, like Sheriff Brody's, and the sharp crack of rifles. He drew one of their horses falling, and the 2 boys running on foot. His simple, stark drawings told the whole story, a hunt that had strayed too close to a settlement, a tragic misunderstanding, a panicked flight for their lives. They hadn't raided any freight wagon. They were just boys in the wrong place at the wrong time. Looking at the drawing, Alina felt a fresh wave of anger at Brody's blind certainty. He hadn't been hunting killers. He had been hunting children. That evening, Chaitan's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. He became delirious, muttering in his own tongue, his body racked with violent shivers despite the heat pouring from his skin. Alina knew she was out of time. The traditional remedies weren't working. There was only one other thing she could think of, a dangerous gambit that Thomas had used once on a gored bull. Maggots. The thought was repulsive, but she had heard old-timers and even army surgeons swear by it, that the right kind of fly larvae would eat away the dead infected flesh and leave the healthy tissue behind. It was a folk remedy, a desperate last resort. She would have to find a dead animal, collect the maggots. The whole process was gruesome, and there was no guarantee it would work. But she had to try something. As if sensing her decision, Tashunka came to her side. He looked at his brother, then at her. He picked up his small, crude knife from the floor where he had dropped it the night before. But he didn't brandish it. He reversed it and offered it to her handle first. It was a profound gesture of trust, an offering of the only weapon he had. At the same time, he once again pointed east, his gaze more determined than ever. Alina looked from the offered knife to the fierce hope in the boy's eyes. Maybe he was right. Her desperate, disgusting plan might not work. His people would have healer's medicine she couldn't dream of. It was a terrible risk sending him out into a hostile territory, but the greater risk she now realized was doing nothing. She made a decision. She took a deep breath and nodded. All right. She said as much to herself as to him. Go. Find your family. She packed him a small bundle, a strip of jerky, a canteen of water, and a piece of bread. She took him to the door and pointed at the moon, then traced its path across the sky. She pointed to the spot where the sun would rise. Come back by sunrise, she said, praying he understood the urgency. The sheriff, he will be back. Tashunka nodded, his face grim. He looked one last time at his brother, his expression a mixture of love and fear. Then he slipped out the door and melted into the pre-dawn darkness, a silent shadow moving east. Alina barred the door and turned back to the sick boy on the cot. She was alone again, but this time her solitude felt different. It was no longer just about her own survival. She had tied her fate to these two boys. She had sent one off into the dangerous dark and was now the sole guardian of the other. All she could do was watch and wait and pray that her act of faith would not be her undoing. The day dawned quiet and tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a rider. Alina forced herself to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She milked her lone cow, fed her chickens, and worked in her small garden, all the while casting anxious glances towards the eastern hills. There was no sign of Tashunka. There was also, thankfully, no sign of Sheriff Brody. Inside, Chaitan was fading. His fever burned like a forge, and his breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Alina felt a rising tide of despair. She had placed her faith in a desperate hope, a boy running through a hostile land. Had she sent him to his death? Was she now simply presiding over his brothers? Around mid-morning, a new sound reached her, the slow, plodding hoofbeats of a single tired horse. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she grabbed the Winchester. But when she peered through a crack in the shutters, she saw it wasn't the sheriff. It was Silas Croft, her nearest neighbor, who lived a good 3 miles down the creek. Silas was a wiry man with a perpetually worried expression and eyes that were always calculating. He and Thomas had never been friends. Thomas had called him a fence-sitter, a man who would wait to see which way the wind was blowing before offering an opinion or a helping hand. Alina had always found him unsettling. He reined in his horse and dismounted, holding up a hand in what was meant to be a friendly gesture. Morning Alina saw the posse riding out yesterday. Just wanted to check you were all right. I'm fine, Silas. Just the storm, she called back, not opening the door fully. Heard they were hunting those Sioux that hit the wagon, he said, letting his horse drink from her trough. His eyes roamed over her property, taking everything in. Nasty business. Can't be too careful a woman all alone out here. I manage, Alina said curtly. His gaze lingered on her doorway, and his eyes narrowed slightly. Smells like you've been doing some doctoring. That carbolic soap has a powerful scent. Alina's stomach tightened. Had to clean a cut on my hand. The axe slipped while I was chopping wood in the rain. She held up her left hand, which she had deliberately nicked with a knife and wrapped in a small bandage just that morning, a crude piece of stagecraft for just such an encounter. Silas nodded, but he didn't look convinced. His eyes continued their restless search, and then they stopped. They fixed on a small object lying in the mud near her woodpile, something she had missed in her frantic cleaning. A single dark brown moccasin, half buried in the muck, undoubtedly lost by one of the boys during their frantic arrival in the storm. It was small, but it was as damning as a signed confession. Silas's eyes darted from the moccasin to her face. He didn't say anything about it. Instead, a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his lips. Well, you just take care now. Brody's offering a reward, you know. $50 for any information. A lot of money for a widow trying to get by. The unspoken message was clear. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to hold it over her. I don't have any information, Alina said, her voice like ice. Right. Well, I'll be on my way, he said, swinging back onto his horse. You know where to find me if you remember anything. She watched him ride away, not back towards his own homestead, but south towards the town of Red Creek. The direction of the sheriff's office. The coiling serpent of fear in her gut was back, colder and more venomous than before. He was going to tell Brody. The $50 was more tempting to him than neighborly loyalty. Panic warred with a cold, hard rage. She was trapped. If she ran, they would hunt her down. If she stayed, Brody would return, and this time he wouldn't be asking questions. He would tear her cabin apart until he found Chayton. Her options had dwindled to nothing. All she had left was the desperate, fading hope she had sent running into the wilderness. She looked at Chayton, his life hanging by a thread, and then looked out the window at the empty hills to the east. The sun was climbing higher in the sky. Sunrise had come and gone. Tashunka was not back. She was out of time. The betrayal was complete. Silas's greed had sealed their fate. She rechecked the load in her Winchester, her hands shaking slightly. She didn't know who would arrive first, Tashunka's family or Brody's posse, but she knew with a dreadful certainty that a storm of a different kind was about to break upon her home. And this one would be a storm of blood and gunpowder. The minutes after Silas Croft's departure stretched into an eternity. Alina moved about the cabin in a daze of dread, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats. She wedged a chair under the door handle and positioned the Winchester on the table aimed at the entrance. It was a futile gesture against a dozen men. But it was all she had. Chayton's breathing grew more labored, each gasp a painful reminder of her dwindling time. She thought about running, grabbing the boy, putting him on her horse, and fleeing into the hills. But where would they go? He was too sick to travel, and they would be tracked and caught within a day. Her stand, however hopeless, had to be here, in the home she and Thomas had built. The sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows. The air grew still and heavy, pregnant with unspoken violence. It was this unnatural silence that alerted her first. The birds had stopped singing. The drone of insects had ceased. An eerie, profound quiet had fallen over the prairie. Alina crept to the window, peering through the smallest of gaps in the shutter. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar landscape. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement on the ridge to the east. Not the disorganized clump of a posse, but a single rider sitting motionless on his horse, a silhouette against the stark blue sky. Then another appeared beside him, and another, and another. They were not white men. They were warriors. Their long hair braided their faces grim, some holding rifles, others bows. They flowed over the ridge like a silent, inexorable river, fanning out with practiced discipline. They didn't charge. They didn't yell. They simply appeared one by one until the entire ridge was lined with them. They moved down the slope, encircling her property, taking up positions behind rocks and in the tall prairie grass. 50 of them. Maybe more. Alina stumbled back from the window, her breath catching in her throat. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't the help she had hoped for. This was a war party. Her mind, reeling with terror, leaped to a horrifying conclusion. Tashunka hadn't made it. He had been captured or killed by the posse, and his people tracking him had found his trail leading here. They thought she was responsible. They thought she had lured the boys in only to betray them to the white men. They had come not for rescue, but for revenge. She was caught between the hammer and the anvil. Brody's posse was coming from one direction, a Sioux war party from the other. Her small cabin was the epicenter of a conflict she could not possibly survive. She looked at Chaitan, his face flushed with fever, oblivious to the ring of death tightening around them. Her act of mercy had doomed them all. From outside there was a single resonant cry, a call that was answered by others from different points around the circle. It wasn't a war cry, it was something else, something she didn't understand. She saw one of the warriors dismount. He was a tall, imposing man, with streaks of grey in his braided hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a magnificent eagle-feather war bonnet, a sign of great authority. A chief. He began to walk toward her cabin, alone. He carried no weapon in his hands, though a rifle was sheathed on his back. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes fixed on her door. This was it. The parley before the slaughter. Alina's hands trembled as she raised the Winchester. She centered the iron sights on the chief's chest. Her finger tightened on the trigger. He was still 100 yards away. An easy shot. She could kill their leader, throw them into chaos, maybe buy herself a few more minutes of life. Her mind screamed at her to shoot. It was survival. It was the law of the prairie. But her heart hesitated. This was the father, the uncle, the leader of the boy she had sent for help. Was this truly vengeance in his eyes, or was it something else? Grief, fear. The chief stopped about 50 yards from the door. He stood perfectly still, a statue of implacable purpose. He raised his empty hands, palms forward, a universal sign of peace. But in the charged atmosphere, it felt like a trap. He then did something unexpected. He called out a name, Tashunka. The name echoed in the silence. It was a question, a plea. And from the tall grass near the creek bed, a figure rose. It was Tashunka. He was alive. He was safe. He hadn't been captured. He had brought them here. But the relief that flooded through Alina was instantly chilled by confusion. Why the siege? Why the silent, intimidating circle of warriors? If this was a rescue, it was the most terrifying one she could have imagined. Tashunka spoke to the chief in their rapid, flowing tongue, gesturing from his father to the cabin, his expression fraught with urgency. The chief listened, his stony face unreadable. When Tashunka finished, the chief's dark eyes settled once more on the cabin door. He took another step forward. And just as he did, a new sound intruded the frantic, pounding rhythm of galloping horses from the south, from the direction of Red Creek. Sheriff Brody was coming, and he was coming fast. The circle was about to close. The arrival of the posse was as loud and chaotic as the warriors had been silent and disciplined. Sheriff Brody and nearly 15 men crested the southern rise, pulling their horses to a panicked halt at the sight of the Sioux warriors. Rifles were leveled, curses were spat into the dust, and the air crackled with the promise of imminent violence. Silas Croft was among them, his face a pale mask of terror cowering behind the sheriff. "I told you," Sheriff Silas shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the cabin. "She's been helping them. This is a trap. They've been planning this all along." Alina watched through the shutter, her world compressed into the narrow slice of prairie between the two opposing forces. She was no longer just a woman in a cabin. She was the fuse in a powder keg. Her home was the battlefield, and Chayton lying helpless on his cot was the unwitting prize. The Lakota chief, whose name was Wanikiu, meaning he who saves, did not even flinch at the posse's arrival. His attention remained fixed on the cabin. He had a choice to make deal with the armed white men at his back, or the unknown situation of his son in the house before him. He chose his son. He ignored the shouts from Brody and took another deliberate step toward the door. "Hold your ground," Brody bellowed at him. "One more step and we open fire." The Sioux warriors tensed, fingers tightening on triggers, arrows being knocked to bowstrings. They waited for the command from their chief. Inside the cabin, a weak voice cut through the tension. 8. "Father." It was Chayton. He was awake, his fever-bright eyes wide with confusion. He had heard his father's voice. That single word changed everything. For Chief Wanikiu, it was confirmation his son was alive. For Alina, it was the key to unlocking this deadly stalemate. Her own fear was immense, a physical weight pressing down on her. But seeing the terror and confusion on Chayton's face, she knew she could not let this happen. She could not let these men, both white and Sioux, destroy each other over a misunderstanding she was at the center of. Making a decision that defied all logic and every instinct for self-preservation, she laid her Winchester on the table. She walked to the door, took a deep, shuddering breath, and lifted the bar. She opened the door and stepped outside into the charged space between the chief and the posse. She held her hands up empty, just as the chief had done. A collective gasp went through the posse. Brody stared at her, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. "Alina, get back in the house." "What in God's name are you doing?" Chief Wanikiu stopped, his gaze falling upon her. For the first time, his stoic expression softened with a flicker of surprise. He had expected a threat, a captor. He saw only a lone woman in a simple dress, her face pale but resolute. "He is sick," Alina said, her voice carrying with surprising strength in the silence. She pointed a thumb back into the cabin. "Your son. He is alive, but he is sick. He has a fever from the bullet." The chief did not understand her words, but he understood the meaning. Tashunka ran to his father's side and began speaking rapidly, explaining everything: the storm, the wounds, her care, the hiding from the posse. As he spoke, Chief Wanikiu's eyes never left Alina's. He was studying her, weighing the truth of his son's words against the reality of the armed men behind him. "It's a trick," Brody Deputy Miller yelled. "Don't listen to her." Alina ignored them. She turned her body slightly so the chief could see past her into the dim interior of the cabin where Chayton was struggling to sit up on the cot. The sight of his son, weak but alive, broke through the chief's final reserve. He gave a sharp command in his language. The warriors behind him didn't lower their weapons, but they relaxed their stances, their posture shifting from aggressive to watchful. The immediate threat of an attack had passed. The chief took the final few steps until he stood before Alina. He was taller than her, a mountain of a man, and he smelled of leather smoke and the prairie earth. He looked down at her, and his eyes, which she had thought were hard and cold, held a profound and weary sadness. He peered into the cabin, his gaze resting on Chaitan. He then looked back at Alina and gave a slow, formal nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement of thanks. The fragile peace was shattered by Sheriff Brody. "That's enough. Alina, you are under arrest for aiding and abetting hostiles. Wanakio, you and your men will lay down your arms and surrender the boys. They are wanted for murder." Chief Wanakio's head snapped toward Brody, his brief moment of peace, vanishing replaced by a cold, dangerous fire. He spoke for the first time, his voice a low, powerful rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. He spoke in Lakota, but his meaning was universal. He was not surrendering his sons. He was not surrendering anything. The warriors raised their rifles again. The posse mirrored their action. The standoff was back on hotter and more dangerous than before. Alina stepped forward again, placing herself directly between the chief and the sheriff's leveled gun. "You're wrong, Sheriff," she shouted, her voice ringing with conviction. "They didn't raid any wagon. They were hunting. They were ambushed. These are children, not murderers. You'd take the word of a savage over your own kind." Brody snarled. "I'd take the word of a boy who draws the truth with charcoal over the word of a man who sees nothing but what he wants to see." She shot back, gesturing toward Silas Croft. "You want information? Ask him. Ask him why he saw a single moccasin and rode straight to you for 50 pieces of silver instead of asking his neighbor if she needed help." Silas flinched as if struck. The other members of the posse looked from him to Alina, a seed of doubt planted. Alina turned back to the chief. She didn't have the words, so she used gestures. She pointed to Chaitan, then made a motion of carrying him. She pointed to the warriors' horses, and then to the eastern hills. She was telling him to take his son and go. It was an act of treason in the eyes of the law, an act of sheer human decency in hers. Chief Wanakio understood. He gave another sharp command. 2 of his warriors ran forward with a travois, a simple sledge, to be pulled behind a horse. They entered the cabin without hesitation. Alina stood aside, her heart pounding, as they gently lifted the feverish Chaitan and secured him to the litter. Brody watched, his face purple with rage, his finger white on the trigger of his rifle. He could start a massacre with one twitch, but he was also a pragmatist. He looked at the 50 warriors positioned perfectly determined to die for their chief's sons. He looked at his own men, a ragtag group of farmers and shopkeepers, their initial bravado fading into raw fear. He knew in that moment that this was a fight he could not win. The warriors brought Chaitan out. Tashunka mounted his horse, taking the reins of the horse, pulling the travois. The entire war party began a slow, organized retreat, their rifles still trained on the posse. Chief Wanakio was the last to leave. He stopped his horse beside Alina. He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a single perfect eagle feather, tied with a strip of blue trade cloth. He held it out to her. It was his highest honor, a symbol of wisdom, honor, and bravery. Alina took it, her fingers brushing his. Their eyes met one last time. No words were needed. He wheeled his horse around and galloped after his people, leaving Alina Harvey, standing alone in the dust between 2 worlds. The dust settled slowly, reluctantly, as if trying to preserve the ghosts of the departed warriors. A profound silence descended upon the prairie, a quiet so deep it seemed to have weight and texture. It was broken only by the nervous shuffle of a horse, the creak of worn leather, and the heavy breathing of the men who remained. The 50 warriors were gone, having melted back into the vast rolling hills, as if they were never there at all, leaving behind only the tracks of their passage and a gaping void in Sheriff Brody's authority. He sat motionless on his horse, his rifle resting limply across his lap, the cocksure certainty that had defined him utterly shattered. He finally swung himself down from the saddle, his movement stiff and weary like an old man's. He walked toward Alina, his spurs kicking up small, angry puffs of dust. The rest of the posse kept their distance, a silent, uncertain audience. Their initial bloodlust had long since evaporated, replaced by a confusing cocktail of fear, bewilderment, and a dawning, grudging respect for the woman standing before them. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Brody's voice was a low, strained rasp, the fury within it, fighting a losing battle with exhaustion. Alina didn't flinch. She stood her ground, the eagle feather held gently in her hand, its fine edges a stark contrast to the calluses on her palm. "I know exactly what I've done. Sheriff," she replied, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I prevented a massacre. I stopped you from turning this piece of land my husband and I bled for into a graveyard. You came here with a story you wanted to be true. I simply chose to listen to the one that was." She turned her gaze cold and sharp as splintered ice upon Silas Croft, who was desperately trying to make himself invisible behind the bulk of another rider. "You came here for justice, Sheriff, but your only informant was a man motivated by $50. Ask him. Ask Silas why his first instinct upon seeing a sign of trouble at his neighbor's home wasn't to offer help, but to ride 10 miles to sell a rumor. Is that the kind of justice Red Creek stands for now?" A low murmur rippled through the posse. One of the men, a rancher named Patterson, whose property bordered the reservation lands, spat on the ground in disgust. "She's right, Sheriff. We came out to hunt killers. Silas not to help you line your pockets by getting us all killed." The condemnation coming from one of his own struck Silas harder than any of Alina's words. He visibly flinched his face, turning a blotchy red. The eyes of his neighbors were now on him, cold and unforgiving. He had broken the unwritten code of the West. You stand with your neighbors against the wilderness. You don't sell them out to it. Brody had no answer. He looked from Alina's unwavering face to the accusing stares of his own men, and finally to the empty cabin, a silent testament to his failure. He had been outmaneuvered not by a warrior's strategy, but by a widow's conscience. With a final weary sigh that was a clear admission of defeat, he turned his back on her. "It's over. Let's go back to town." He mounted his horse and spurred it into a trot, not looking back. The posse followed a fractured and disordered procession. They rode not as a unified force of law, but as a group of chastened men, each lost in his own thoughts. Silas Croft trailed far behind them, utterly and completely alone, an outcast riding into his own self-made exile. In the weeks that followed, Alina learned the true cost of her choice. In Red Creek, she became a ghost. The whispers that had once been behind her back were now replaced by a stony, suffocating silence. Mrs. Gable at the general store would serve her, but would count her change without meeting her eye. Men who had once tipped their hats would now find something intensely interesting to study on the other side of the street as she approached. She was branded an Indian lover, a woman who had sided with the savages against her own. Yet her new reality on the homestead was profoundly different. Her isolation, once a source of constant low-grade fear, was now a blanket of security. One morning, not a week after the confrontation, she opened her door to find a large buck lying on her porch. It was freshly killed, dressed with a hunter's expert skill. There were no tracks, no sign of who had left it. She knew. It was a gift. a statement. Her pantry was restocked with meat for the winter. Another time, after a vicious early snowstorm had buried her woodpile, she awoke to a clear morning and the impossible sight of a new, massive stack of perfectly split oak and pine, far more than she could have chopped in a month. It had been left as silently as the deer. Chief Wanakio had not forgotten. His people were watching over her. This silent, powerful guardianship was a greater protection than the law had ever been. She never saw Tashunka or Chaitan again. She often wondered if Chaitan's leg had healed, if they had returned to their lives, if they ever thought of the white woman who had hidden them beneath her floorboards. She would likely never know. But as she sat by her fire in the evenings, the Winchester rifle now felt less like a tool of defense and more like a relic of a former life. On the mantel, the eagle feather stood in a small clay jar. It was her most prized possession. It was a reminder of the day fear had knocked on her door, and she had answered with courage. She had learned that the world was far more complicated than the simple divisions of settler and savage, law and chaos. She had found her true place, not within the fences of her property or the walls of a town, but in the vast, untamed space between two worlds, a quiet legend whispered on the prairie wind. The story of Alina Harvey isn't found in the official history books. You won't see her name alongside famous lawmen or notorious outlaws. Her tale is one of those quiet legends whispered around campfires and passed down through generations, a testament to the fact that the true history of the West was forged not just by gunfighters and generals, but by ordinary people faced with extraordinary choices. She was a woman who, when faced with hatred and fear, chose humanity. In saving 2 boys, she may have lost the comfort of her community, but she gained something far more valuable, a profound understanding that the lines we draw between us and them are as fragile as a prairie dust devil. If this story of unexpected courage and the complex soul of the American West moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of the frontier's true spirit. For more stories that dig deeper into the past, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. And I want to hear from you. What did Alina's choice mean to you? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.